When we oversimplify things and suggest that a single molecule intervention is going to cure a disease, we often come up short. And particularly in the case of neurodegenerative diseases, we find this over and over again, right? This paradigm that we're going to have this molecule like that's going to get rid of amyloid and we're going to cure Alzheimer's. Despite billions of dollars in research funding and decades of super intelligent people's time, that hasn't panned out. That hasn't worked. What we do see works is this more complex system science approach that I don't want the word complex to alarm anyone. Really, we can do this systematically. We can look at the brain and at the body, and we can say, what causes imbalance or dysregulation? So, if imbalance is the cause of disease in this case, right, this can be applied to any complex system, whether it's a financial system or a government system or an educational system. If we think that the brain is a complex system and there's imbalance in it, it's going to lead to dysfunction or dysregulation. And so, what is imbalance? It's too much, too little, in the wrong place, or at the wrong time. So fundamentally, what we're looking at here, what are the causal level factors? What are the primary factors that are going to create dysregulation and imbalance? There's oftentimes we can look downstream. We can say, oh, inflammation is the cause of dementia. Yet, if we can ask, why is there inflammation and come up with an answer, then that's not the cause. The cause is one step before that, right? Or maybe a couple steps before that, depending on what we're talking about. Amyloid is much like that as well. Amyloid, these molecules that we think of as the cause of dementia from a conventional perspective, they are a response. Amyloid is actually antimicrobial. So this will pop up to protect us from things like herpes simplex 1 or from Lyme spirochetes or from gingivitis causing bacteria. And so what we want to keep doing is going back to, why is this happening? What's triggering it? Can we create balance at a causal level? And those six factors, there's basically six things that I would argue when they're out of balance, they cause neurodegenerative diseases and many of the complex chronic diseases that we see associated with aging. And those six things are toxins, nutrients, structure, stressors, infections, and signaling. And when we look at those in a very systematic way with our patients, with our residents, with our coaching clients, we often find that when we address them, create more balance, we get improvement at the cellular level. And then, of course, where it really matters, which is in cognition.
Hmm. Excellent. There's so much there that I want to dig into. I was actually taking notes to make sure I can come back to some of these things that you mentioned there. One thing that you said there that I really liked, and actually happens to be something that I've been writing a lot about in my book, is this kind of this paradigm, this culture that we have created in medicine, where we take these what are, as you said, complex systemic problems, and we are insistent on trying to look for the one mechanism or the one molecule that is the thing that quote unquote causes this condition. And based on that idea that we're going to find this one mechanism that is problematic and causing this problem, then what we do is we go to a chemistry laboratory and we synthesize man-made chemicals that are specifically designed to target and interrupt this specific one mechanism that we believe to be causing this illness. And there's two aspects to this. On the one hand, it's kind of, you can kind of understand how we all got convinced that this is a good way of approaching things, because it was hugely influenced by the antibiotic revolution, which really was a case of, okay, there's this one problem, this organism that's causing this disease, and if we just develop a chemical that kills this organism, we can cure the patient. And it does work in that context, or historically worked in many different infectious diseases where that actually turned out to be a good approach. But then based on this, we sort of applied this to all illnesses, that this is the model that we need to think through. What's the one thing that quote unquote is causing this disease? What's the one chemical that we can use to fix this cause of the disease? And it's been just such an enormous failure on so many levels, over and over and over again, for basically every chronic disease, 8 out of 10 of the diseases that kill us are diseases of lifestyle. And this model has just been a massive, like unbelievable scale failure over and over again for these things. And yet, what do? We go, okay, well, I guess we haven't found the one mechanism and the one right drug yet. Let's keep searching for the one mechanism and the one right drug to fix this disease. And it's just kind of astounding to me. And I mean, obviously, it's heavily influenced by financial incentives, but I'm wondering if you can go deeper into that story and that sort of paradigm and why it's problematic.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, right? The incentives, if you follow the incentives, you will, I mean, it tells the story. So when we think about the way that we approach Alzheimer's and how, with this complex system science approach, looking at it from a holistic perspective, I'm trained as a naturopath. What we see is we get great outcomes. And not only do people end up with better cognition, more independence, more ability to live fulfilling lives as they age, but they also resolve their hypertension and they also resolve their weight issues and their bones get stronger and their mood gets better and their diabetes resolves. And so, what we're doing is really creating more health. Yes, our focus and the nuance around what we're doing is very much directed towards a family who's affected by dementia and Alzheimer's. However, what we're doing is really about whole brain, whole body health. And when we take these single molecules, you mentioned antibiotics, and I think this is such a great contrast to what we're suggesting because when I talk about my reversing Alzheimer's approach, Dr. Bredesen's approach, this isn't a cure. This is a lifestyle. And what we see is that many people who jump on the train, right, who get on it with us, who dive in fully, who do the approach, they get better. But if they get off, it doesn't last. The symptoms come back. So it's not a cure. Like you mentioned, antibiotics. If you have a urinary tract infection or a sinus infection and you take antibiotics, you're cured. You don't typically have to think about it unless something else is going on. But typically, that can be a thing of the past. You don't have to revisit it. This is not that. This is about a cellular function. It's not about a single organism causing this disease. It's about a milieu of things. And that's why we want to think through this for the individual with precision medicine. There is not one path that you take to most complex chronic diseases. It's multiple things that add up, that stack up, that spiral in a negative direction towards cellular dysfunction. And what we want to do is turn that around. And so in the book, I actually talk about some of, I think, what you're alluding to, but what happened with the story of Alzheimer's is actually this phenomenal book that any Alzheimer's nerd out there would read quickly on a plane ride. It's called How Not to Study a Disease, The Story of Alzheimer's by Carl Harub. And he describes these three elevations. And the first one was in 1906 with when Alzheimer, he was the doctor for a patient Auguste D, who had Alzheimer's, the original case of memory loss. And then when they did the autopsy, they saw these plaques in her brain. And then his teacher put that case into a textbook. Now, it was a single case that should never be in a textbook because usually what we want to do is get sort of a consensus. You want multiple cases. You want there to be a trend, not just a single outlier case. But he was trying to sell a new edition of his textbook. And so he included this case. And this was the first elevation. Now, there were a couple of others that happened in the 70s as the National Institutes of Aging came around. If you talk to doctors who were in their 70s and 80s, they'll say, why is it called Alzheimer's and not senile dementia, right? The people who were practicing in the 80s, 90s, like in the last century, right? They're like, why is there this distinction with Alzheimer's? It's because of marketing and the desire to get funding for the National Institutes of Aging, not because of any science.
Wow.
And then again, later on, the incentives around the pharmaceutical industry, right, are to look for these single molecule interventions because they can patent them. And so then you can fund the drug trials that are necessary to get through FDA approval. But you need to be able to patent the medication in order to afford the millions or billions of dollars that it costs to get up to that point, right?
And can I just
Yeah,
interrupt for
please.
1 second, like, because I don't want what you just said is so important and so profound that I don't want it to be lost in the mix of what you're saying. Because just that one thing that you just pointed out is like, I want people to understand how that one factor alone is so hugely responsible for shaping our entire system of medicine.
Right. So if you you need to have funding to get through these very expensive trials. Dr. Bredesen, my mentor, and I both have done clinical trials. They're small. Had 23 participants in my trial. He had 25 participants in their trial, and they were both funded by philanthropists
Mm.
because we can't work inside the system because there's nothing to patent on the other end of these trials. And so that's part of why it's slower. It takes longer. We were funded for our trial in 2018. We didn't publish until 2023. COVID had something to do with the delays there, but not all of it. It often will take 18 months to get IRB approval, the internal review boards, which are very, very important in the case of Alzheimer's because they're there to protect vulnerable patients in these human trials. So there's a lot of red tape. There's a lot of hurdles to get through, and a lot of them should be there. Now, in the case of Alzheimer's, there's another really important part of the story. Um, in 2006, there was a paper that was published that basically connected the dots between amyloid and cognition. And before that, this hadn't really been done. So, with amyloid, one of the things we want to understand is that amyloid is present in all of us. There's less than 2% of the population, if you take babies, infants to centenarians, less than 2% of the population doesn't have amyloid. And then when you get to those later stages of life, there are people with perfect cognition who have lots of amyloid. And there are people with poor cognition, with dementia, who don't have any amyloid.
And
So,
isn't amyloid also a case of like it's much more dynamic than we've been generally taught to conceptualize, meaning like don't we accumulate some bit of amyloid on a daily basis and that it's cleaned out on a daily basis?
yeah, especially if we're getting sleep, right? If we have sleep deprivation, then we get a measurable accumulation of amyloid even in one night. And then if
Right.
of course, if you extrapolate that over decades, that's going to lead to a measurable and significant accumulation of amyloid. So the amyloid is an indication that something is dysregulated. It's not causal. It is
Mm.
certainly correlated. But there's also a lot of exceptions to that, right? It's not a clear-cut line. When you get rid of amyloid, you don't actually get better cognition. We would have solved this problem if that were the case. And what happened in 2006 was there was a mouse study, um, uh, and I don't want to go into all of the drama, but basically it was the images that connected these dots were
I
doctored
actually had this
images.
I had this on my list to ask you. So
Yeah.
by request, I would actually like you to go into all of this drama because I think it's also important for people to understand just how deep the corruption and fraud within the field of medical science can be, and like how influential those financial incentives can be in corrupting good science.
And I don't know that I personally want I don't want to vilify someone, right? I think that the vast majority of people who show up to do this work around Alzheimer's are dedicated, smart, caring individuals who really want to reduce the suffering associated with Alzheimer's. I think that most people, the vast majority of people, come to this work with that intention. And in this case, there was a paper published that was highly influential. It's been cited over 2,500 times, and it was used to justify more dollars, more taxpayer dollars, more NIH funding to go towards this amyloid hypothesis. And the refrain in Alzheimer's research for a long time was if you're not studying amyloid, you're not studying Alzheimer's. And so if you weren't in the they refer to this amyloid mafia, right? Like if you weren't in that group, you weren't getting funded. And that's not good science,
Yeah.
right? There's this idea of the null hypothesis, right? You're not trying to like prove something. You're trying to prove that you might not be right, right? Or that you might be right. Basically, you're trying to keep your mind open,
And
right?
that dynamic, which is really a psychological dynamic and sort of a cult dynamic where you're sort of part of the in group or the out group depending on the paradigm in which you view a problem. I think those kinds of dynamics exist across the board in the way basically all diseases are studying and the pursuit of treatments for all diseases. It just so happens that with Alzheimer's, you have this unique situation where the very sort of foundation of that way of viewing the disease and trying to cure the disease has been exposed as a big fraud. And so now it's like it's really in our faces. It's become very obvious just how problematic those sort of psychological cult dynamics, in group, out group stuff, even to the point, as you said, of whether you get funding or not, how influential that has been, and what a big mistake it's been. But I think those same kind of dynamics exist probably across the board in the way a huge number of diseases are being studied.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. My focus is so much on Alzheimer's. However, this paper that I'm referring to is in the process of being retracted by every author included on the paper except for the one at fault. And that particular gentleman is still employed at the university that he has been at for decades, and he's still receiving NIH funding. And that, I think there's an injustice there, right? There's been misdirected funds. This seems very clear. Many people have looked at his images. There's other papers that also, I think, are in the process of either retraction or have been flagged as having sham images included in them. And so I am disappointed because this came out a year or two ago. This came to light, and there hasn't really been justice served. And there was this amusing article that I read the other day where basically there are other people who misused NIH funding to like go to Fiji or like to go to strip clubs or gamble. And they have been seriously reprimanded, right? Like there has been justice served. I think some of them maybe even ended up, I don't know exactly what it was. I don't know that they ended up in jail, but there was like a justice that was done. And when I think about, and the point of the article was really to come to the conclusion that like actually that paper that was cited so many times, that was used to justify so many taxpayer dollars, that was used to direct the kind of how the research dollars were spent and what was focused on, that amyloid would be focused on more versus other things that might have gotten us more traction. There are people suffering today with dementia that might not be if that hadn't happened 20 years ago, right? If we might have used all those dollars in a much more resourceful way because we had better science. And so I think that like that fires me up, like that gets me mad, right? That
Yeah.
like there's still not justice there. So anyways, what are we doing that actually I like to talk about solutions more than that
Well,
stuff.
hold on 1 second before we go there. We'll definitely get there, but there's another layer to this evidence around the amyloid stuff, which is important, and I think it's also worth stating that the paper that you're referring to was this. This wasn't just okay. Yeah, this was a case of these scientists lied or misrepresented something, and now they were caught. It was that this whole idea, this whole hypothesis of what's causing this disease had a massive influence on the whole, researchers around the world of how they view the education of the public, right? Like hundreds of millions or billions of people became indoctrinated into this paradigm that Alzheimer's is caused by these amyloid plaques, and then that influenced not only the public, it influenced scientists, pharmaceutical companies. Everybody's now pursuing trying to cure this condition by developing drugs that block the formation of amyloid plaque. And I think that's another interesting layer to this discussion that I'd like to have you speak to, which is what that they did develop drugs that were successful in blocking amyloid plaques, and what happened with those.
Yeah, so like right now there are the monoclonal antibodies that are available, and donanemab, the Eli Lilly medication, I think it's about to be approved by the FDA. That's been delayed a little bit. Leqembi or lecanemab is available right now and FDA approved and available through Medicare if you meet certain criteria. And then aducanumab or Aduhelm, that one's been taken off the market. These are all in the same category of drugs, and these are these first generation monoclonal antibodies that take amyloid out of the brain. And what we see with this approach is that these are each increasingly like kind of marginally better than the next, right? So Aduhelm being the first one, Leqembi being the second one, and then donanemab being the most recent. And what we see is that they are each slightly less risky. Maybe they slow the progression of the disease a little bit more, but none of them meaningfully improve the patient in terms of their cognition. So when you take amyloid away, you don't get an improvement in cognition. No one gets better. What we do see is that you get a slowing of the disease process by about 30%. And so For, from my perspective, I've worked closely with families for years now, and drawing out a torturous process is not typically that valuable. Now, for some people, it's an IV that you can go get. You don't have to do much more than that, although you do need to be close to a major medical center because the risks are brain bleeding and brain swelling. And this happens in about 30% of patients. And so you need to be near a major medical center so that you can have the MRIs done to double check that you're not having these side effects happening.
And potentially death, right? I mean, I think I remember Dr. Bredesen when I spoke to him about this, that he said, yeah, I can slow the disease process by 30%, but you have this huge risk of side effects and potentially death from the drugs themselves.
Yeah,
Correct me if I'm wrong on that.
I mean, I think that when you're studying a group with Alzheimer's who is older, that you're often when you do studies with thousands of people, there are deaths because people are at that stage of life. And I
Sure.
can't speak to, precisely like the increase in the risk of death. I do know that there's an increase in the risk of hemorrhage, brain bleeding, and brain swelling because you're
Right.
basically ripping the amyloid out, including from the blood vessels. So there's certainly risk associated with these medications, and the they're expensive. They're really expensive. They're used in mild cognitive impairment. And when we say mild cognitive impairment, there's nothing mild about this. So Alzheimer's has these four stages. The pre-symptomatic stage, which is before you even notice that there's anything going on. And that can often last for decades. And then there's that symptomatic stage where you're aware of it, that you notice, or maybe your family starts to notice that you're not remembering names or you're not remembering the words and nouns as well as you used to. And that's a subjective cognitive impairment. And then we have this mild cognitive impairment, which is actually when it's measurable and you're on this progression towards Alzheimer's. And again, it's not mild. It's highly impactful. People are losing their jobs. They're not able to take care of their financial health. They're not able to potentially like plan a trip, right? Like your life is impacted. You can still have a conversation typically, but you're on that slippery slope towards Alzheimer's. And so with these medications, they're approved for that mild cognitive impairment stage. So this isn't like a last ditch effort when somebody has severe Alzheimer's. That's when we're going to decide to spend the money and take the risk. This really is something that you do when you're still out going to birthday parties and enjoying Christmases and going on trips with your spouse that you've waited your until retirement to take. And so I think that a lot of people come into my office and they're like, okay, well, we'll try this. And then if it doesn't work, we'll think about Leqembi. And it's like, it doesn't work that way. You don't wait until you get further progressed to then try these medications. So I think there's some misconceptions around them. And then many people are coming out of pocket, although it's covered by Medicare. I think that the average cost per patient out of pocket is still over $8,000 for these medications. So it's not a small amount of money. Inflammation, just like amyloid or just like many of the diagnoses, right? This is sort of this, we're going to label what's going on. There's inflammation. And when you think about that, so like you and I, we've both been inflamed. Inflammation is a natural process. This is part of the body's divine design. If I twist my ankle, I want inflammation to occur because that's part of the healing process. If I get an infection, I want inflammation to occur. It's part of the healing process. Now, if that inflammation lasts for a really long time, we want to understand what happened. Is there a signaling pathway that's off? Is there a cytokine, this self-perpetuation of a cytokine storm that's going on that maybe needs to be interrupted? But typically, inflammation starts because something triggers it. And if we miss the opportunity to ask what was the trigger, we miss the opportunity to get real healing, right? And so inflammation, I listed just a couple of things that can happen, right? An infection, an injury, a traumatic brain injury in the case of the brain, right? That can put us at risk for dementia later on. An infection like this is a great opportunity to talk about COVID, right? COVID creating these cytokine storms that when we put that on top of inflammation that was already existing, right? With COVID, it's this great illustration of some people die from COVID. Other people have long haul COVID. Other people never even have a symptom, right? And what's the difference? It's that this is where a lot of people understood the idea of comorbidities, other things going on in this environment, right? In the host, when that virus came into the host, what was already there? What was the milieu of inflammation and inflammatory factors that might have already been there? High blood sugar, high blood pressure, stress, potentially structural issues, like not getting enough air into the lungs and not getting enough oxygen in the brain at night because of sleep apnea, right? This is going to create a much more inflamed state. And then when we add another trigger on top of it, it can get out of control. And so this also happens with dementia and Alzheimer's is when we already have some inflammation in the system for whatever reason, and then we add a couple more, now we have so much inflammation that's out of control. And we can add fish oils and we can add some turmeric and we can add all of these like
Why
anti-inflammatories,
not
right?
take anti-inflammatory drugs if
Yeah, or incense
the
or
cause is inflammation?
yeah, or steroids, right? Steroids are something that we'll use. But what they do is steroids in particular, they suppress immune function. They make us
Mm.
more at risk for other infections. They over time they can create bone loss. They can uh, adrenal issues. There are many, many, many things that can go wrong when we add anti-inflammatories. And again, we miss the invitation to say what is causing this and how do we get to the root cause and get real healing.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I came through a, very classical training at Caltech and MIT and Duke and UC San Francisco and looking at, how does brain disease work? And I set up the laboratory actually way back in 1989 specifically to look at what drives the neurodegenerative process. Why is it? This is such a common problem, and you could argue that it's the area of greatest failure. As physicians, we have not been able to do anything about ALS, about Alzheimer's, about Lewy body, about frontotemporal dementia, corticobasal degeneration, just go right down the list. It has been an absolute disaster. So we wanted to go into what are the molecular mechanisms, and we wanted to find, what's that one fold of one protein. And my wife, who is an integrative physician, said to me, it was now about 25 years ago, well, whatever you guys find in the lab, it's going to have something to do with energetics, and it's going to have something to do with lifestyle and how much sleep you've had and whether you're under stress and whether you have had a horrible diet and all these sorts of things. And I said, no, 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 no. We're going to find one fold of one protein. We're going to create a drug that targets that. Everything's going to be great. Well, interestingly, the science itself, that's what's been so interesting to me. The science has led us away from the classical view. The classical view is turning out to be wrong. And it's led us into a view, and it's actually a beautiful story in that we see that Alzheimer's disease now is really a network insufficiency. You have this amazing network. You have about 100 billion neurons. Each one has nearly 10,000 connections on average. So you have almost 1 quadrillion synapses in this amazing supercomputer you have inside your skull. And of course, there are all these factors that are critical. So there is a supply and there is a demand. And when the supply is outstripped by the demand chronically or repeatedly, of course, it has to downsize. So you have this downsizing network over time. And so, of course, it turned out that the things that contribute to this are your sleep and your exercise, your energetics, your ongoing inflammatory processes and all this. So I had to realize, I should have listened to her all those years ago because we would have gotten to the answer sooner. But having said that, coming at it from the molecular basis, you can actually see the molecules that drive the problem, and you can see exactly what to do to prevent it and to reverse it. So it's been such an exciting journey to see. And then, of course, the best of all, to see human beings. We started with the first patient in April of 2012. She's now over 11 years and sustaining her improvement. And that's a huge issue because when you have sustained improvement, it means you've actually gotten to the root cause of the problem. Whereas if you use your typical approach, you don't get sustained improvements. As you know, you get a little bump and then you go right back down. And in fact, the sad part is studies of the various drugs like Aricept and Namenda that have been used for Alzheimer's have shown that over the years, they do worse than people who are untreated. That's how bad it is. So forget sustaining improvement. They actually do worse than no treatment. And just recently, a paper came out showing that the people who were treated with the antibodies, such as Leqembi and things like that, actually underwent more rapid brain atrophy than those who weren't treated, so that they actually had the size of a brain associated with dementia earlier than the untreated patients. So it's been a real problem. And again, that tells you they're not getting at the root cause of this problem.
I think that this is largely a matter of paradigm more than anything else. And I think what you're describing is a microcosm of the entire field of what modern medicine and biomedical research and pharmaceutical development has encountered with its approach to almost all chronic disease that's plaguing humanity right now. It's sort of this focus on the molecular mechanisms and then developing some kind of synthetic chemical pharmaceutical that's designed to interfere or block that particular mechanism. And it works really well in the context of antibiotics when there's a clear bad guy in the body and we can attack it and kill it. And it seems to work horrifically poorly in the context of almost all chronic diseases, as far as I can tell. So tell me more. I'm curious if you agree with me that this is a matter of paradigm, like the access to this way of seeing things and this approach to treating it. I think is not, you don't arrive at it if all you do is study the molecular and genetic and biochemical mechanisms of the disease. If all you're doing is focusing on the amyloid plaques and the neuronal degeneration and then trying to develop synthetic chemicals that interfere with those processes, I don't think that you can go down that pathway of thinking and then ever arrive back at, oh, well, actually exercise and eating a good diet might be the answer instead of more synthetic chemicals poured into the system. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. And you're right. That has been really the crux of the problem. So what happens when you become a physician, you're told you have to do things this way because otherwise people will die. So it's very much like being in the military. You do it this way. You better cut here. You better make sure that it's an aseptic field or you're going to kill somebody. So you have this mindset that you've got to do exactly what you're told. Well, then you've got a disease like Alzheimer's where there's no treatment. So they're telling you, okay, it's about amyloid. Go find that thing that removes the bad guy. You need to start much earlier and say, well, what is actually causing this problem? Why is the amyloid there? And this, this old idea, the amyloid's there to give you Alzheimer's, is so silly. The amyloid is there for a reason. And it turns out that it is a beautiful response to various insults. Just as you said, you have pathogens. The amyloid is a beautiful sequestrant and antibiotic. So it is an antimicrobial peptide that's been shown beautifully and first discovered actually by professors Robert Moyer and Rudy Tanzi at Harvard several years ago. And so, it is killing, and it's interesting. It has antiviral activity. It has antibacterial activity. It has antifungal activity. It's pretty remarkable, but it also has this interesting property of being a sequestrant. So you essentially coat these things. Great way to keep you away from these. Unfortunately, of course, because it is also part of the innate immune system. So it is part of your response to inflammation, part of your inflammatory response, which is one of the reasons we've pointed out Alzheimer's is about two major things: energetics, inflammation. Too little energetics, too much inflammation, you're on the wrong side of the curve and you are downsizing. So unfortunately, because of that, it's also doing things like, for example, it interacts with complement. And Professor Ben Barres from Stanford showed a number of years ago that as you age, your synapses are often covered with complement. Kind of remarkable. So you're in this kind of
and just explain to people what complement is, because a lot of people won't be familiar with that.
So again, another part of the immune system that helps you to kill bacteria and other microbes. Actually, you have a whole complement cascade that ultimately results in punching holes in the pathogens. So again, this is all part of your response to these problems. And it is interesting because it's part of a response where you're trying to kill these bacteria and fungi and viruses. But it's also part of, okay, we don't have enough energy to support 500 trillion synapses. We're going to have to downsize. So it's actually part of the downsizing. And one of the things it's doing is inhibiting insulin receptor signaling. And it is inhibiting some of the trophic factor signaling. It's almost as if, imagine that you have a situation where you have 10 children and they're all 10 going to die of starvation, but you've got enough for 7. Then you may get rid of 3 of them, unfortunately and sadly, and then the other 7 can survive. And that's kind of what it's doing here. It's basically saying we're going to put additional stress. We're going to downregulate this support, and the weak ones are going to go. And then the ones left, as we now are going to slowly get rid of that amyloid, are going to survive. And one of the intriguing things to me is, why would you lose memory early? That's such a horrible thing to lose. Well, it turns out, if I said to you, hey, you can wake up tomorrow morning and you can either not remember new things. You can remember everything that's come up till now, so you can live your life, do all sorts of wonderful things, but you're not going to be as good going forward at remembering new things. Or you can wake up tomorrow morning and you won't remember how to speak or how to read or how to do your job. Well, that's an easy choice. And so most people can do extremely well with all the things they've learned up till the age of 45 or 55 or 65, et cetera. And I should add, when I was training way back in the 80s in neurology, we thought of Alzheimer's as a disease of your 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. We now know it's really a disease of your 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s that's diagnosed 20 years later. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, it is moving into earlier people. We see people all the time now diagnosed in their early 50s, when we never used to see that when I was training. So things are changing, and we're beginning to understand a lot more about why that is and what to do about it. Actually, I'm writing a paper right now on these long-term sustained improvements, where we have people over a decade who've improved and then sustained their improvement. It's really exciting to see.